Welcome back to Good Law, Bad Law. We are always debating, it seems, whether we should have a bigger government or a smaller government, more or less government. But according to my guests today, the co-authors of a new book called Reorganizing Government, Alejandro Camacho from the Irvine School of Law in California, and Rob Glicksman, an environmental law professor from GW Law School in DC. The question isn't really so much big versus small government. The real question is how to deliver government service on issues that we all do care about in the most efficient and effective way. And they argue that we have been engaging in that conversation with our eye completely off the ball for too long. And they talk about exactly how we can do a much better job of that, whether it comes to the government's role in intelligence gathering, the government's role in inspecting food to make sure we have good food safety in this country, and so many other areas of the government's involvement in our lives. It's a fascinating and important conversation, one I hope all political candidates might pay attention to, because it's something of great importance to all of us. My guests, Alex and Rob, on today's issue of Good Law, Bad Law. Stay tuned. On today's episode, we're talking about the government, the federal government, the size of the government, the ways in which government works well and in many instances doesn't work well. It's a common theme that comes up during election season, as your classic liberal may think about ways to expand the federal government, and your classic kind of small c conservative is going to talk about we've got to get the size of the government under control. But that is so much easier said than done. And my guests today know an awful lot about that. And we're going to talk about what else we need to understand besides those very basic concepts. My guests, Alejandro Camacho and Robert Glicksman. Guys, thanks so much for being on Good Law, Bad Law today.
Thanks for having us.
so much.
So, Alex, I want to introduce both of you briefly. And the book that you've written, which is called Reorganizing Government, a Functional and Dimensional Framework. Alex, you're on the law faculty at the University of California, Irvine School of Law. And Rob, you are on the law faculty at George Washington Law School, University Law School in DC. And I know both of you come to this work with a background in environmental law, which I find very curious. So maybe you could each take a turn at just giving a little background on yourselves beyond that, and then we can get to the question of how you came to tackle the federal government itself. Alex, do you want to go first?
Sure, that'd be great. So, as you mentioned, I'm a professor of law at UCI Law, and I'm also the faculty director of the Center for Land, Environment, and Natural Resources. It's certainly true that most of my work in the regulatory area is in environmental and natural resource law and public lands law, pollution control law, land use law. But what is also true is that my work generally, probably the overriding theme that keeps getting explored, is sort of thinking about the goals of regulation, the structures of regulation, the processes of regulation, the role of public participation, the role of scientific expertise, how we allocate authority and relationships between institutions. And so It's certainly true that a lot of my work is focused in the environmental area, but in part, the genesis of the book was an interest in that, how that plays out, not just in environmental law, but also in other areas.
Okay. And Rob, what about you?
I, in my 11th year as a faculty member at George Washington University Law School, and before that, I taught for many years at the University of Kansas School of Law. My areas of expertise, like Alex, include environmental law and natural resources law, but I also teach administrative law, which is a body of law that basically looks at the procedures by which the government, the federal government, operates, and in particular how administrative agencies like the cabinet departments work. And I have devoted a good bit of my scholarship over the past several decades to looking at how authority to govern ourselves ought to be allocated both between the federal government and the states, and within the federal government between the executive, legislative, and judicial branches. So I've been interested in how to allocate authority for many years, and I see this book as kind of a culmination of that interest.
Well, I want to get some very basic concepts on the table to understand this issue as we dive into it a little bit more. Because I think when most people think about authority and the law, probably most people think about criminal law, or they might think about civil law, like the law of contracts between two parties, or law of what happens when somebody's in an accident and is injured, or that kind of law. But when you talk about administrative law and regulatory law, I mean, that's something probably a lot of people don't think about. But at the same time, I think that must make up most of what the federal government actually does in terms of law. And in terms,
I think not just with the.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah,
I want you to give us some background on that.
Well, I think that's certainly. I think that's true not just for the federal government, but it's also true for state governments. It's also true for local governments in many ways. That many people, their interaction with the law, they may think as sort of the obvious sort of extreme example as being in the criminal context, but a lot of people when they're dealing with the law on a day-to-day basis are dealing with it in the context of the ways that our executive branch helps administer the law and implement the laws passed by our legislative branch in areas as broad as environmental law to immigration to and basically health and safety, food safety, even in dealing with markets. So there's no doubt that in many ways on a day-to-day basis, how people interact with the law is primarily, I think it's fair to say, at least heavily shaped, if not primarily shaped, by administrative processes.
Mm-hmm.
Let me add this.
Go ahead, Rob.
Add this. Most of the federal government operates through the activities of administrative agencies like EPA or the Interior Department or the Internal Revenue Service or the National Labor Relations Board. These are called administrative agencies. They exist within the executive branch and are supervised in some respect by the president. But no administrative agency has inherent authority to do anything. Agencies get all of their power to manage the government through statutes passed by Congress. So when Congress passes a statute, it essentially contains the marching orders that EPA has to follow when it wants to issue regulations to protect people from exposure to harmful pollutants. We then have the judicial branch, which is there to make sure that the agencies actually follow those marching orders, that they're acting pursuant to the proper procedures, and that they're only doing what they've been authorized to do and no more. And the law really has a large say in constraining how agencies operate.
Right, and this is a whole area of sort of current controversy in terms of the role of administrative agencies, because there are those, including some now sitting on the Supreme Court, who feel that the power of administrative agencies has gotten out of hand, and it's really outside of the structure of three branches of government defined in the Constitution. But that's a whole other conversation. What should we do about that? But you guys are, in your book and in your work, are looking at the question I teased in the beginning, which is, apart from saying the obvious, which is that the size and complexity of the federal government has grown tremendously over the last many decades, and has grown in both Democrat and Republican administrations, in both Republican and Democrat Congresses. Anybody who says that they want to tackle making the federal government work better, more efficiently, more effectively, really has their hands full. And so first of all, I guess, Rob and Alex, why is that? I mean, why is that such a complex task to even contemplate? And perhaps you can even get into why President Trump, who sounded that note as well early in his presidency, met with kind of immediate defeat in trying to reorganize the government. Alex, I'm going to nominate you on that one.
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think if I understand the question correctly, I understand that you're asking to what extent how do we manage, or how do we think about the role of agencies in the carrying through the day-to-day activities of government, and how, as you mentioned, conservatives tend to take a orientation of skepticism towards the authority that agencies levy, and progressives tend to be much more optimistic about the role of the agency. And in many ways, the approach of our book is to think about that question slightly differently, and it's to say that it's not about I think a lot of folks, when they think about administrative agencies, or I think the core issue that you're dealing with is a very pragmatic one. Is somebody decides that there's some sort of problem, a social problem that government it needs to play a role in, and the primary way that in policymakers think about that question is to think about, to the extent that they're thinking about how to create this program, they focus on sort of what I would call sort of the substantive standards. They think about what sort of standards are we going to hold people to, and those are important questions. And secondarily, and this is where administrative law comes in, they think about sort of what sort of procedures are we going to use to constrain or enable agencies to act, to carry out those substantive standards. That really, people call it administrative law, but that's really, in many ways, it's administrative procedure law. It's about procedures that constrain agencies. And what we're saying fundamentally is that those are two important pieces to think about, but you should also be thinking about, and we don't think enough about, and when people do think about it, they think about it incorrectly, how to allocate authority to the agencies, which agencies should have authority, and the relationship between those agencies. These are critically important pieces that people often ignore. Or, as you mentioned, the Trump administration and a few other executives have done this as well, thought about how we need to reorganize how things are done. They think about it in such a narrow way that they ignore important possibilities and important considerations in doing that organization.
Well, right, and that's why I teased. That's why I teased in the beginning. It's the way most people talk about it, and most people think about it is in such simplistic terms. I mean, Democrats now are talking about expanding Medicare as part of a solution to our healthcare crisis. Necessarily, that's going to lead to increasing the size of that federal program. On the other hand, Republicans often talk about eliminating whole departments, entire agencies of the federal government to appeal to people who want to see government be smaller. But, you're talking about things that go much deeper into this, to the kinds of problems that you have to think about if you really want to solve for those goals of having a more efficient and effective government. And you raise one of those issues, centralization versus decentralization, not only between the federal government and state governments, which is pretty common way of thinking about dividing up responsibilities, but also centralization versus decentralization within the federal government. Rob, do you want to address that?
Sure. Let me just go back a step quickly and indicate that one of the reasons I think that we decided to write this book was that we were, I think, a little bit unhappy with the tendency of people to criticize government on the ground that, well, they tried to manage this social problem and they did a bad job of it. And so the obvious reason for that is government is overly intrusive. There's too much of it. We ought to be eliminating some of these regulatory programs and agency authority and returning things to the operation of the free market. And our point is, among other things, well, sure, sometimes regulation doesn't work because it's a bad idea, but sometimes it's not because it's a bad idea. It's because authority to implement those programs has been divided up in a way that doesn't make sense, in a way that's likely to frustrate rather than promote the goals of the program. So you referred to our distinction between centralization and decentralization. Let me give you an example of one of the case studies that our book looks at to illustrate how things might have been done differently to provide a better result. So it's important to all of us that the food that we eat is safe, that it doesn't create risks of illness upon consumption. It turns out that the federal government has within it about 15 different agencies that are responsible for different aspects of food safety regulation. You've got the Agriculture Department doing some of the task. You've got EPA doing some of the task. You've got the Food Drug Administration doing part of the task. And to some people, it makes no sense to have 15 different agencies tackling what they refer to as the same problem. And our point is, well, maybe the way it's allocated currently is not ideal, but we don't necessarily need to centralize everything in one agency, which is the usual proposal put forward by people who are unhappy with the current configuration. Our point is there's a middle ground between complete centralization and complete decentralization. Why don't we, instead of moving all authority into one mega agency, divide up authority so that different agencies, EPA, FDA, Agriculture Department, all are responsible for performing different tasks. So maybe it is the job of one agency to accumulate information about the different risks that people are exposed to when they eat food. Maybe we grant to a different agency the authority to adopt regulatory standards to ensure that the food supply is safe. And maybe we allocate to yet another agency the authority to enforce those standards by engaging in inspections and then bringing any necessary enforcement action. And we think that over time, allocating authority in that way has the capacity to create a more efficient governmental regime, but also it would allow the agencies tasked with performing different functions to develop expertise in those functions so they're less likely to make mistakes as they go forward.
So let me see if I understand, because I love the case study involving food safety, because it really does make all the points here. And starting with the idea that I think some take, which is, well, if government, as you said, if government is taking on this problem, they're not going to do it as well as the private sector and the free market would do it. But food safety is such a great example. I mean, do we really think that the private sector and the free market are going to watch out for food being safe so people don't get sick or die? I mean, there's a lot of historical evidence to suggest that probably a lot of people would get hurt and would get sick, and many probably would die too if it was left to the free market. So that this does seem like a very worthwhile social issue for government to have some role in. I mean, that's got to be the starting point, right? Is it government has to have a reason for being in whatever part of life or business we're talking about, and this does seem to be a very valid issue for government to be involved in. Would you guys agree on that?
Yes, and I think I think our starting point is that there are a number of issues for which the public sector can play a role in helping address sort of problems that the market is unable to address. And I think there are lots of examples of that. And we're talking about in financial markets, we're talking about in civil health and safety, we're talking about environmental. And in many ways, the best way to frame it is to say that it's the government intervention is making sure that the market is acting more efficiently, that it's ensuring that the parties who are participating in it are taking into consideration some of the harms that they may be, what's often called by economists, sort of externalizing onto other people. And so we start with the premise that there are some problems that for which the government intervention clearly needs to play a role. And then the second order question is at least as important, and that is, okay, so the government should play a role. What should be the organization of how the government plays that role? So, we say that there are two broad categories for thinking about the allocation of authority. The first one is what we've sort of different components of authority. When most people focus in on thinking about, okay, now we got to address this problem. And in many ways, law's role is to break that conduct or problem into legally digestible parts. And what most people, legislatures, agencies, and scholars even, mostly focus on breaking things down into a specific problem or component. This is what we call substantive jurisdiction. So endangered species, or air, or immigration, or something like that. But another way, and Rob alluded to this before, another way of understanding authority is based on the particular governmental, what we call governmental function or functional jurisdiction. It's a wonky way of saying, but it's really just saying there are different sorts of activities or functions that government does, funding activities, or research, or planning, or standard setting, or enforcement. Those are all different functions. And so any allocation of authority involves a substantive allocation and a functional allocation. It's just not often explicit. So the government is supposed to address immigration, and it's given certain functions to do that. And so that it seems a relatively small thing to point out, but it's an incredible. It actually ends up playing a significant role in devising alternatives for addressing a problem. And then that's sort of the one category we say for thinking about allocation of authority, sort of how you describe the activity the government is doing. So in addition to thinking about the sort of components of authority, what I was describing as sort of the substantive aspects and the sort of functions that the government does, the book introduces this concept of saying, in addition, there are three different dimensions actually of the allocation of authority. These are sort of, again, on a continuum. You can have more or less of them. And one of them we already talked about before. That's the one that's quite familiar to most people. Is sort of what we might say is between decentralized and centralized authority. Right. How local do you want the authority to be versus at the more federal level? But there are two other dimensions that are often ignored or at least neglected. One of those other ones is between what we say is overlapping authority and distinct authority. How much does the authority between two regulators overlap versus are distinct from each other? With an overlap example being two agencies that are given authority over a particular problem, say NSA and CIA over certain types of intelligence gathering, versus two agencies or two authorities with distinct authority. A perfect example that might be California and Virginia, both having authority over some problems, but they have a distinct authority. They don't really overlap in their authority, say, over land use regulation. So that's another dimension that's different from how central or decentralized it is. And then the third dimension is, to what extent is that authority exercised independently of other regulators or coordinated with other regulators? Again, that dimension really thinks about how much do regulatory authorities, how agencies or states or other authorities coordinate along different, again, government functions. So on one extreme, you can have no coordination where they act completely independently and even potentially are competing with each other, to on the other end where they coordinate a lot and they synchronize and even harmonize their activities. And so the overall basic framework of the book is to say, when people think about allocating authority, they only really focus in on, or primarily focus in on, only certain aspects of that, namely the substantive, and sometimes thinking about what level of government. But they're missing so much more about that. So much about how much overlaps and coordinates. Yeah.
Well, let me pick up on that, because I think overlap. The problem of overlap is perhaps people don't think of talking about it in that way. But when, for instance, we hear people in business complaining about the extent of regulation over business today, and uh, President Trump has made an issue of wanting to cut regulations, the number of regulations. It seems like part of what they're getting at is this issue of overlap that you're referring to. And I again love
Right.
the food safety area as such a great way to illustrate this. And you guys have a chart in the book where you're looking at food inspections, for example, and how, and so I think most of us know that food manufacturing facilities um, uh, are susceptible to being inspected by federal regulations of varying types. But the idea that because of the multiplicity of regulations, the multiple different agencies involved in regulations, you can have a scenario where um, certain plants, which are investigated on a daily basis by the federal, what is FSIS? Is the Federal Safety Inspections, Food Safety Inspection Service?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then other plants may be inspected every 5 years by the FDA, and that could break down on something. It seems as arbitrary as whether your facility produces corn dogs or produces bagel dogs, produces beef broth versus chicken broth, produces open face meat sandwiches versus closed face. I mean, all these different distinctions can have tremendous and confusing results in terms of which agency, which regulations, which frequency is applied. So if you were giving greater consideration to the problem of overlap, for example, how would that perhaps be looked at differently?
Well, I think you raise at least two problems there. The first problem relates to the efficiency by which government operates and the burdens that it imposes on regulated companies. So it seems to make little sense to have 4, 5, 6 different agencies all inspecting the same facility to make sure that the food that it supplies is safe to eat. That's a waste of the government's money, because you have inspector after inspector after inspector coming in and essentially looking at the same aspects of the company's business. And it's burdensome for the facility being inspected, because it has to prepare for and conduct a series of sequential inspections. And so in that sense, having many agencies essentially performing the same function, inspecting to make sure that facilities are complying with regulatory standards, is inefficient and wasteful.
Yeah.
And in that particular situation, it might make sense to have one agency, or at least a smaller number of agencies, engaged in the task or the function of inspection. The second problem that you raise is a problem of consistency. And so it seems to make little sense to have a facility producing food number 1 be inspected once a month, and a facility preparing food number 2 to be inspected once every 5 years, as you said, especially if the degree of risk that they present is pretty much the same. And so you'd want to organize government in such a way as to either have the same entity responsible for inspecting multiple kinds of facilities on the same basic schedule, or at least if you're going to have multiple agencies inspecting, you want to make sure that they're essentially operating pursuant to the same degree of frequency and the same degree of oversight as each other.
Right, because I think. Yeah, well, go ahead, Alex.
Yeah, because I mean, I want to. There's a couple other great points that are sort of buried in there that I think are important to sort of try to pull out, and that is, in some ways, I'm going to stick up a little bit for overlap in a way that most people, I think, who think about it, don't. And that is that there's a couple problems that routinely occur. As you mentioned, both the, progressive and conservative administrations have said, in the food safety context and others, there's too much overlap. And the solution that the most common solution that's offered is centralization. And what we, on a very basic level, what we say, that doesn't make any sense. If you think the problem, because they are on different dimensions, if you will. If you think the problem is too much overlap, the solution to that's more likely to achieve the ends that you care about is to create more distinct authority. In other words, rather than thinking about, if you think the problem is just too much redundant systems, then the solution maybe shouldn't be to create, one centralized authority, but maybe to remove the overlap between the different ends. The second point I wanted to make is that, I think this is an important one, is that, often folks think about overlap as having costs, and it does have costs. But overlap can have benefits as well. And we've seen a number of contexts where overlap has, safety net benefits. One example that's often pointed to is at the intelligence gathering context. That generally speaking, when you're doing, national security intelligence gathering, having only one entity trying to gather intelligence information, it's risky to only leave it to one entity to do. And that often having multiple entities doing it will help create a safety net. If one misses something, another one will get it. So I just wanted to point out, and I think in one of the chapters we used the analogy of locks on a front door.
Yeah,
most of us have more than one lock on a door, and having more than one lock on a door does cost something. There's no doubt you have to buy the second lock. You often, every time you have to lock your door, you got to lock it a couple times. There's some cost to that. But there are real benefits to it as well, because it probably increases safety. Now, if you've got 100 locks on your door, that might be kind of crazy in a number of ways.
Yeah.
Cost as well, both in terms of having to open and close the door, but also to pay for the stuff. So, the question often though is how much overlap is good. It's a different question than whether it should be federal or state, or what level of centralization should there be.
But see, you brought up intelligence gathering, and that's, I think, brings up and highlights the importance of another variable that in your book you both argue should be given much greater attention, which is coordination. And we've seen that in intelligence gathering, particularly since 9/11, where we now have a director of central intelligence, not to replace NSA or CIA or any of the other agencies involved in intelligence gathering, but to provide better coordination of those agencies, each of which is engaged in somewhat different aspects of the problem, or the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, again, which was not to replace varying other agencies and parts of agencies dealing with issues under that umbrella, but to provide greater coordination. So that's an issue that gets at the question of overlap and the question of multiple agencies, or things being decentralized, is not necessarily being a bad thing as long as you've got good coordination.
The story we tell about intelligence gathering is essentially a story about mixing up dimensions. So after 9/11, there was concern that the various U.S. intelligence agencies, the CIA, the FBI, the National Security Administration, weren't communicating with each other. And that had they done so more effectively, there would have been a better chance that the information necessary to anticipate and stop the 9/11 events would have been more likely to occur. And so part of the problem was that agencies like the FBI and the CIA have a sort of historical tendency to keep the information they gather to themselves. Either they don't trust the other agencies, or they want to gain credit for using the information in an effective way. And so the constant criticism that arose after 9/11 was, we need better coordination among these agencies. They need to be working together so that we get the benefit of their expertise in an aggregated and coordinated fashion. Unfortunately, what we see that Congress did in trying to respond to 9/11 was not to reallocate authority in a way that resulted in better communication, but instead to centralize authority. for example, by creating the Department of Homeland Security, which was an agency that essentially consumed a dozen or so other agencies. So you had a diagnosis, not enough coordination, and then a prescription, which was greater centralization. We think there's a mismatch between what the policymakers thought the problem was, not enough coordination, and the solution they proposed, which was greater centralization. If you simply centralize 12 agencies in one huge new agency, you're likely to have subdivisions of that agency that still might not have the capacity or the inclination to talk to one another in ways that lead to better coordination. So our point is, at least Congress should have thought about leaving the essential structure the way it was in terms of keeping the 10, 12, however many agencies that existed in existence, but taking steps to mandate that they share information more effectively with each other and thereby achieve greater coordination. And we think that's a general failure on the part of policymakers and others who think about government organization. They diagnose the problem along one of our three dimensions, the proposed solution along another. Not likely to work effectively.
Right.
And that's why we think that in many ways, our sort of way of thinking about this should be appeal to not just the progressives, but to progressives and conservatives in some sense, saying, take it on your own terms. You identify what you consider the goals of this program to be, what authority you care about. Are you more concerned about under-regulation or over-regulation? But then when you make when you propose allocations, do them in ways that sort of address the problem that you have. So, the two most common sorts of problems are they identify, a problem of too much overlap. The solution they come up with, centralization. That doesn't make any sense. Another one, which is the one we're talking about here in some ways, there's a lack of there's a real problem of lack of coordination. What do they come up with? They centralize. And again, you shouldn't be surprised that that's not going to be effective because it's not moving along the dimension that would address the problem as you yourself have defined it.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think your approach is entirely policy neutral. This isn't meant to get into questions of, should we do more on healthcare at the federal level or not? Should we, have more money spent on improving food safety, in this country? But more, once you do select a goal and therefore a role for government, how do you go about delivering that government service in the best way possible? And, I wonder what you think, because if the federal government was a private conglomerate, corporate conglomerate, a lot of these, you would think that somewhere along the chain of management would be a department of efficiency that would be looking at these questions, because private business would be worried about its profits ultimately and therefore reducing its costs where possible. But and certainly the government would benefit from that from the standpoint of delivering its services more effectively if it can deliver them more efficiently. But with the government being the largest employer in the country, and it always being easier to find new ways to spend money than to cut the spending of money, I mean, how do you think some of the proposals that you lay out and some of the ways you discuss thinking about reforming and reorganizing government, how do you think that actually takes place? Or what needs to happen in order for that to take place, do you think?
I think one of the problems is that the basic decisions about how government ought to operate are made by members of Congress when they're considering statutes. And they often really don't have a whole lot of expertise in the questions that they're thinking about. And one of the things that we urge at the end of our book is the creation of a new body of experts that will explore, investigate the way the government has operated in the past, what things worked, what things didn't work, which allocations of authority effectively addressed these problems, which ones did not, to develop a sort of ability to provide advice to policymakers that will enhance their ability to allocate authority among government agencies in ways that are more likely to achieve the substantive goals that the policymakers are interested in achieving. And as you say, this is not an approach that's limited to people who are in favor of more or less government. It's policy neutral. We're trying to encourage people to think about things in ways that will result in more effective government, not more or less government.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, obviously we have our own sort of, priors for things that we think about in terms of whether we're more concerned about overregulation or underregulation. And to be fair, they probably do come through in the book, but we're pretty explicit about those. That being said, we think those with a different perspective would clearly find use in this system. But I think the core point that that Rob makes that is essential is that these policymakers are not experts, but it's not surprising that they regularly ignore the different trade-offs of different allocations because there's limited evidence on to assess trade-offs. So even if they care about, well, is this likely to be effective or not, or is this likely to lead to under-regulation or over-regulation, or is this type of coordination going to be effective versus allowing them to be more independent? There's no one that, or very few sort of assessments of that sort of thing. So we think what's essential to making government work more effectively is setting up this sort of approach to government, which basically gives an agency that currently exists, something like a GAO, a Government Accountability Office, or something like a Congressional Research Service, somebody in government that does sort of assess, or Inspector General, some agencies often have. So agencies that are tasked with being relatively neutral, but asked to assess, how effective is government being, and doing that not just with regard to the substantive goals of the programs or the procedures, the administrative procedures that are used, but on thinking about the relationship between agencies. So when you've got the food safety example, you can have somebody looking at it in a way that makes sense, that says, is there too much overlap? Well, what are the alternatives for dealing with that? It doesn't mean you have to consolidate into one mega federal agency. You could give one agency A functions 1 and 2, and you can give agency B functions 3 and 4, and see how does that work. That'll eliminate the overlap, and maybe that'll be more effective because it'll allow for expertise and maybe some experimentation or some other things that are beneficial about having multiple agencies, but limiting the inefficiency. So setting up a system that allows for that sort of periodic review and maybe adjustment of authority will allow for learning and ultimately make government itself perform better and help policymakers perform better.
Well, and I also think, and I think this is also part of what you're saying, that once we get past these very superficial arguments of, I want more government, I want less government, I want to expand this program, I want to cut that program. Once you get past that, which is often only as deep as the conversation goes in most of our politics today, then you can really focus on the actual substance, the goals that you want to achieve through government. I don't think there's many people that would say government shouldn't be involved in food safety, for example, or intelligence gathering, or making sure financial markets don't lead to people being ripped off of their retirement accounts. I mean, a million things you could mention, but we don't really talk as much about those substantive issues in specific terms because it's all very superficial. And I like how you have tackled these issues. And I think the idea of, if a good liberal program came with something like the GAO, as you said, a real commitment to efficiency or to looking for ways that some new program might make unnecessary because of overlap, some other existing and not very effective program, that I think that would lend a lot more credibility to the argument we should add this to what we want government to do. And on the other hand, if you're more a limited government type, make an argument based on how things can be done more effectively rather than just slashing at it, which leads to people saying, you're a heartless conservative, which is a criticism, that gets brought up anytime people talk very superficially about cutting government. So I like this as more down the middle as an approach to that everybody, I think, should subscribe to, that we're going to have a role for government, but yes, let's find ways to make it as efficient, effective as possible.
One of our hopes.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think that in many ways, the framework is what I really get excited about with the framework is that it gives, it actually makes it increases the opportunity for that sort of pragmatic action, and also for increasing the feasibility of reform. I mean, the idea, just on a very pragmatic level, if you're a conservative or a progressive, and you say we need to overhaul this program, the amount of heavy lifting that's required is massive, and often going to get tied up in lots of sort of superficial arguments. But actually saying, no, you don't have to eliminate, you don't have to consolidate into one mega agency. There are things you can do to make it run more efficiently. Get people, everybody wants, as you mentioned, very few people are going to be like, I want government to be as inefficient as possible. Everybody wants some efficiency, but they also want it to be effective. And so how do you design it in ways that increases effectiveness without, but also promote efficiency? Well, there are lots of alternatives that people are ignoring because they're focused on a very simple sort of, it's got to be big government or little government.
Yep, exactly. What were you going to say, Ron? We'll give you the last word here.
Sure. I was going to say that a lot of the conversation about how the government operates and should operate is couched in political rhetoric on both the left and the right. Yeah. And as you say, the conversation usually just scratches the surface and is fairly superficial. And so what we're hoping, one of our hopes for the book is that we will help to engender a more reasoned conversation about how government ought to be designed and structured that will get beneath that sort of government is too big, government is too little, to think about ways that can accomplish goals that everybody cares about in ways that will be consistent with both the political left and the political right, that will think about the trade-offs of organizing government in different ways and hopefully reach an accommodation that this is an approach that's worth trying.
Well, and I think you've done that, and I think it's a fascinating and important read. It's called Reorganizing Government: A Functional and Dimensional Framework. It's published by the University of Chicago Press. Co-authors Alejandro. Go ahead.
It's just NYU Press. It's obviously New York University Press.
Oh,
I'm sure they would want that to be.
What did I say?
You said Chicago.
Oh, University of Chicago. New York University Press. You're right. Thank you for correcting me. Alejandro Camacho from Irvine School of Law in Southern California, and Rob Glicksman at the George Washington University Law School, co-authors of the book. We'll put a link up in the description for this episode so people can get more information and actually purchase the book if they'd like to. And I want to thank both of you gentlemen for great conversation, really important. I hope there are some policymakers and politicians in our audience who are listening and paying attention, because, as you said, we should all want the government to work better for us all. So thank you so much for being on Good Law, Bad Law. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. It was fun.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been fun.